Hello, welcome. I hope your coffee is warm because today we're exploring something a little more unsettling. In the world of magic, not everything is about epic battles. Sometimes it's about fear. A fear that takes form and manifests in ways that feel way too familiar. Have you ever had that sinking feeling of falling? Or have you felt like something was watching you even when you were alone? Maybe you recognize the dread of falling that wakes you up like from a nightmare, or the panic that grips you when you were paralyzed in place as you tried to wake up. Well, in Duskmourn those fears have become real. They have become creatures and enchantments, and today we're going to look at them, if you dare. So, take a sip and let's dive into the world of manifested nightmares. Imagine waking up in the dead of night, your surroundings illuminated by an eerie, otherworldly glow. A massive alien figure looms over you, its face a grotesque amalgamation of human fears. This is the fear of abduction, a nightmare that embodies the terror of being taken, ripped from the safety of your home or life without a trace. As an enchantment creature, this card is not only represented to the personal fear of being abducted, but it also embodies it mechanically. To cast this, you must first sacrifice a creature you control, a symbolic representation of something important being taken from you. Upon entering the battlefield, fear of abduction wastes no time. It immediately exiles an opponent's creature, reflecting the suddenness and irreversible nature of abduction. However, like many nightmares, it doesn't last forever. Once fear of abduction leaves the battlefield, the creatures it has taken are returned to their owner's hands. Yet the damage has been done. The terror, the loss, and the sudden uncertainty of existence linger. The art captures this perfectly. The massive alien looms above a bed, its eyes reflecting human faces in torment, emphasizing that this fear is deeply personal and universally felt at the same time. The aggressive wind blowing through the windows adds a sense of unease, making the room feel like a place of discomfort, no longer safe from the unknown. Few things are as universally terrifying as the sensation of being trapped, whether physically or mentally. Fear of immobility is the manifestation of freezing you in place. In the story of Nina, her legs refuse to obey her desperate commands to run, and her voice falls silent as terror grips her body. This enchantment creature represents paralysis in the truest sense, because when it enters, it taps an opponent's creature, and if the creature belongs to an opponent, it is further burdened by a stun counter. This echoes the helplessness one feels in the grip of immobility, where every effort to move or escape is stopped. The ghastly deer with its open torn body is not only grotesque, but also a symbol of being stuck in a place of suffering. The anguished faces rising out of the body, aflame and ghostly, speak to the internal torment that comes with immobility. The mental anguish that burns as much as any physical pain. In today's world, the fear of being constantly watched, judged, and exposed is more real than ever before. Fear of surveillance taps into this collective anxiety, the idea that there is always something watching, recording, even the things you'd rather keep hidden. As a nightmare creature with vigilance, the fear of surveillance never sleeps, never stops observing. Every time it attacks, it surveils, peering into the future, peering into your life, sorting through the top cards of your library, always searching for something to expose. In this way, it mechanically reflects the invasive nature of constant observation. Nothing stays hidden for long. The central eye-like face is surrounded by smaller orbs, all staring, all watching. It stands in a brightly lit room with the floor decorated with a moth motif, symbolic of being drawn into the light, unable to hide in the shadows. This guard captures the oppressive feeling of having nowhere to hide, of being exposed, of being before judgment. And then the dreaded nightmare of failure. I knew that this type of guard would be all too real. It is a fear that plagues us all. Whether it's an exam, a performance, a simple task. The fear of not measuring up can be paralyzing. Fear of failed tests brings the anxiety that we all feel into a physical form. A monstrous being whose very presence marks failure. In gameplay, this creature reflects the consequences of that fear. Every time it deals combat damage, you draw cards. The more it attacks, the more you must confront the reality of your failure. It's relentless, just as the fear of underperforming can be. In the art, we see a disturbing blend of academia and nightmare fuel. A monstrous figure with many arms and a half-formed face looms in a library, marking failed tests with a giant red pen that seems to draw its power from the anguish of the students it judges. The tests flow from its face like tears, a constant reminder of the failure it causes and the tears that inevitably come from that. From failing to falling, the sensation of falling, losing control, plummeting into the unknown is a primal fear shared by almost everyone who isn't a bird. Or maybe they feel it too. Fear of falling brings that terrifying experience into the realm of Duskmourn, where gravity is not just a force but an active agent of dread. This flying nightmare attacks not only the player but also their creatures, sapping their strength and robbing them of their ability to fly. Just as in real life, where the fear of falling can make us feel weak and powerless. This guard physically weakens an opponent's creatures, dragging them to the ground, hopefully for them. The endless depths, the crumbling solid ground, and the monstrous figure falling endlessly with ghostly faces trailing behind. These are all reflections of the helplessness and dread associated with this fear. The chains swirling into the depths suggest that this fall is unending and that escape is impossible. Now picture this. No, there is no rest. You've come to know someone. For years, you have fought alongside them, trusted them with your deepest fears, and believed that they had your back no matter what. Then, in a moment of horror, you discover that they were never who they said they were. This is fear of impostors, a creature that masquerades as something familiar only to reveal its monstrous form at the worst possible time. As an enchantment creature with flesh, fear of impostors sneaks in, disrupting your opponent's plans by countering a spell. But here's the twist, it leaves them with a nagging dread. That dread manifests itself as a creature, but what kind of creature? The opponent doesn't know, and neither do you, until it reveals itself later. In this sense, the nightmare isn't just the immediate betrayal of the counterspell, it's the uncertainty that lingers because there could be more. Mechanically, the manifest ability embodies this unease. The top two cards of your opponent's library become both a mystery and a threat. One becomes a 2/2 creature, a hidden force they have to contend with. The other card is sent to the graveyard unseen but potentially dangerous as well. This adds layers of anxiety, just like an impostor's deception. The true danger might still be hidden, waiting to strike at any moment. Now, once again, with many of these cards, you are lying in bed, aware of every shadow around you but unable to move. You can't scream, you can't run, you can't even stand up. And there's something above you, something watching. This is the fear of sleep paralysis. It embodies that exact terror, a 6/6 flying nightmare that descends with the weight of pure helplessness. This card taps into the primal fear of being unable to act. Its eerie ability activates whenever it's or another enchantment enters the battlefield, forcing an opponent's creature into paralysis. Worse yet, it places a stun counter on them, a sign of true entrapment. These creatures will never be able to untap, trapped under the oppressive weight of the nightmare. But it's not just about tapping creatures, it's about the feeling of powerlessness again. The opponent sees their strongest forces frozen, unable to fight back, as though gripped by an unseen terror. This is no ordinary tapping effect, it's a more permanent type, as the stun counters prevent any hope of relief. The nightmare doesn't just descend, it lingers, keeping its victims locked in place, their strength meaningless. A demon with multiple arms, its mouth covered as if mocking the silence of its victims, floats above the paralyzed. Faces of anguish are trapped within its dark robes, their voices unheard as the nightmare continues to suffocate them. The sense of dread is overwhelming. It's not just about the physical paralysis, but it's about the mental struggle of wanting to escape and knowing you can't because of some force that's above you. You can see it, but you can't do anything about it. Isolation is a fear that creeps in slowly. At first you think you're alone for the moment, but as time passes, the silence becomes suffocating. Fear of isolation plays on this anxiety, a nightmare that forces you to retreat from the world, only to find that solitude is its own kind of terror. This enchantment creature demands a sacrifice right from the start. You must return a permanent you control to its owner's hand before you can even cast it. It's a symbolic withdrawal, pulling away from the connections you've made, leaving you alone on the battlefield. And once it's in play, it drifts through the air with its 2-3 body, haunting the skies like a bird of ill omen. The fear here isn't immediate, it's deeply psychological. As you remove your own resources, you wonder if you'll ever get them back. The nightmare feeds off this anxiety, much like how loneliness feeds on itself. The longer you're isolated, the more you begin to believe that maybe no one ever cared at all. A grotesque bird with white wings and numerous hands that should be comforting, but instead they seem to reach out in despair. The central face with its beak is alone, trapped, while smaller anguished faces spill from its eyes, not able to see the faces that wanted to be with him. The visual message is clear. When isolation takes hold, it warps everything, turning comfort into something distorted and cruel. This is a personal one. Teeth falling out. It's a universal nightmare, again, that moment when you feel one start to loosen and suddenly they all come crashing out. Fear of lost teeth captures this primal anxiety, transforming it into a small but deadly nightmare. A 1/1 creature, but one that leaves a mark when it dies. Mechanically, this card represents the nagging fear of loss. When it dies, it deals 1 damage to one target and grants you 1 life in return. It's a small effect, but one that carries weight, like the unsettling sensation of losing your teeth in the future. It lingers and has consequences. You gain something from the experience, but it's hard to say whether the trade-off was worth the pain. What makes this nightmare particularly unsettling is how it feeds on destruction. It wants to die. It makes you feel that sudden loss, and just like the fear it represents, the damage it leaves behind doesn't seem huge at first, but that 1 point of life or damage could be the difference between survival and death. A creature made entirely of teeth, bloodied and writhing, standing over a dentist's table. Souls of the lost float above it, as though the monster consumes not just the teeth, but the very essence of fear from it. The gnashing mouths and swinging arms speak to the chaos of losing something you thought would always be there. And the more you stare, the more unsettling it becomes. Fear of the dark looms large as a 5/5 nightmare, stalking the battlefield. The twist, its true power only emerges when the light is gone. If your opponent controls no glimmer creatures, this nightmare gains menace and death touch, becoming nearly unstoppable in the shadow. This card reflects the terror of the unknown. In the dark, every shape could be a threat. Every corner could hide danger. As it attacks, it forces your opponents into difficult decisions. Block and lose creatures to its death touch, or let it through and suffer the consequences of a lot of life lost. Either way, it capitulates on fear, turning hesitation into a weapon. The moment fear of the dark strikes is when your opponent is at their weakest. When they have no glimmer to light the way, it's a card that thrives on the absence of hope, and in doing so it reflects the way fear of the dark plays tricks on the mind. The longer you go without light, the more powerful the fear becomes, until it's too late to fight back. The monster itself seems to be made of melting candle wax, snuffing out the last source of light as ghostly figures rise around it. Moths flutter in the background, casting erratic shadows, creating a scene that feels like it's on the verge of complete darkness. The message is clear: once the light is gone, there's no escaping the nightmare. Now imagine the rush of being pursued relentlessly. Your heart is pounding as the sound of clocking grows closer and closer. Fear of being hunted doesn't lurk in the shadows, it's out in the open, savagely taunting its prey. Savoring the rising panic, this nightmare doesn't hide, it wants to be seen, wants its victim to know the terror is inevitable. Mechanically, this 4/2 creature with haste demands attention. It must be blocked if able. The sensation of being hunted is all-consuming. There's no escape, no place to hide, and every turn it forces an opponent to confront that terror. In gameplay, it becomes a relentless force that makes combat unavoidable, mirroring the overwhelming dread of realizing that no matter where you run, it's always right behind you. But it's not just a simple creature, it's a representation of what's inside. The art encapsulates this terror perfectly. At first glance, it seems like a fox-like demon retreating into a hole, as though it's a prey. But then you see the scattering gear of a Duskmourn survivor beneath it, and you realize the twisted reality. It's the hunter, not the hunted. Its face, a gruesome human split skull, reveals that this nightmare is not about survival. It's about the inevitability of being caught. Floating faces of anguish drift above it, haunting reminders of those who've tried and failed to escape. The nightmare doesn't just stalk its prey, it revels in the chase, in the moment when hope turns to despair. There are few horrors as inescapable as the fear of being consumed by flames. The heat, the smoke, the agonizing pain, all while knowing there's no escape. This fear embodies the excruciating nightmare which is arriving in the burst of fire and agony. When this 4/4 nightmare enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. It's an immediate visceral experience, like the sudden flare of flame spreading uncontrollably, burning everything in its path. 4 damage is not nothing. But the real horror comes when the delirium mechanic kicks in. Once you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard, every source of non-combat damage you deal is magnified. Fear of burning alive takes that damage and turns it back on the creatures of those suffering from the fire. The nightmare doesn't stop with the initial burn, it continues to spread, consuming everything in its wake, and that's why you can't escape. We see a monstrous insect-like being, its spindly legs barely able to support its weight as flames pour from its gaping mouth. It's not just on fire, it is fire. Its body is a twisted, burning mass with the faces of anguish etched into its side, screaming in eternal torment, of course. The fire it spits isn't just physical, but it's spreading wherever the nightmare goes. Every moment feels like an opportunity slipping away. Fear of missing out takes that anxiety and turns it into a living nightmare. The thought that someone somewhere is experiencing something you aren't, an event, an opportunity, a connection, gnaws at your soul. It's a jealousy driving you to seek out more, even as it consumes you. This 2/3 nightmare forces you to discard a card upon entering the battlefield, only to draw one in return, because you didn't want to miss the one card you drew. The fleeting nature of satisfaction is represented here. You give something up, hoping for something better, only to find yourself in the same place, chasing after the next moment. The delirium ability further shows the frantic nature of this card. If you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard, FOMO allows you an additional combat phase, but only after untapping a creature. The nightmare drives you to keep going, to chase after the next thing, but no matter how many phases you get, the emptiness remains. The art is chaotic, capturing the essence of this fear. A grotesque, demonic insect-like creature with 4 tendrils and spindly arms is caught in a frenzy. From its gaping maw it roars, spewing the faces of anguish, or maybe eating them up. And just as quickly as it releases them, it sucks them back in, as if the horde that experiences its fears missing. The nightmare is never satisfied, it always hungers for more. The fear of exposure is not just about being seen, it's more physical than that, and I think that's why it's in green. It's about the terror of vulnerability, of having your darkest secrets and insecurities laid bare for the world to judge. Fear of exposure is a nightmare that strips away the layers of protection you've built, leaving nothing but raw fear. Mechanically, this 5/4 nightmare requires a cost before it even enters. You must tap 2 untapped creatures or lands, a symbolic act of submission. You give up your resources, your defenses, to allow this fear to manifest. And once it's there, its trample ability ensures that no matter how hard your opponent tries to block it, some part of that fear will get through. They're exposed too. The art captures the horror of exposure. A massive, grotesque creature stands on 2 spindly arms, its body dominated by a gaping mouth that reveals 4 anguished faces within. These faces, twisted in a torment, represent the secrets and fears that can no longer be hidden. The nightmare's maw is wide open, exposing everything to the world, and there's no way to close it, no way to hide again. Some nightmares never end. Fear of infinity taps into the existential dread of it never stopping. The terror of being trapped in a cycle that repeats forever, with no hope of escape. The Ouroboros, a symbol of infinity, perfectly embodies this nightmare, consuming itself in an endless loop. This 2/2 creature has flying and lifelink, but it can't block. It's not here to protect, it's here to linger, to drain away your life little by little, and its eerie ability reflects the endless nature of this fear. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield or when you fully unlock a room, Fear of Infinity returns from your graveyard to your hand. No matter how many times you think you've rid yourself of it, the nightmare always comes back. It's a never-ending cycle, a fear that you can never truly escape. The art is chilling. An Ouroboros-like creature consumes its own tail, its long skull-like face twisted in a grotesque grin. From its elongated mouth, green faces of anguish pour out, representing the soul trapped in its endless cycle. The nightmare's forms loops in on itself, never breaking, always consuming. As we leave Duskmourn behind and step out of the darkness, it's clear that these nightmares aren't just cards. They're windows into the most primal and terrifying corners of our minds, how basic they might seem. Whether it's the fear of being hunted, the creeping dread of exposure, or the unsettling thought of infinity. Each of these nightmares brings a unique story to the battlefield, but remember, like every fear, these too can be faced. In the game, just as in life, knowing your fear is the first step in conquering it. So I hope I've taught you something about these fears so that you can conquer them in your games later. Thanks for joining me, and I'd like to thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.